Chapter 3. Mrs. Gandhi. Indira Gandhi had a personal connection to Bengal. Her father, Jawaharlal Nehru, the great opponent of British colonialism who would become India's founding Prime Minister, had given her a demanding if inconsistent education. In 1934, at the age of 16, with her father once again stuck in a cramped British jail, Indira Nehru, who would grow up to be the first woman Prime Minister of India, was packed off to study in the wilds of Bengal. She had already had a singular schooling, of a kind, enduring an uncertain, anxious, and often lonely childhood, with her aristocratic grandfather, resolute father, and sickly mother campaigning for India's freedom and paying for it with long, wretched tours in British prisons, sitting in on her father's meeting with Albert Einstein, visiting her father's dear friend and mentor Mohandas Gandhi, the revered Mahatma himself, in jail, where he would affectionately pull her ears. But Santiniketan, the abode of peace, in the glorious countryside of what today is West Bengal, north of Calcutta, now called Kolkata, was no common place to learn. The school there was founded by the celebrated Bengali poet and philosopher Rabindranath Tagore, who would write the national anthems for two unborn states, India and Bangladesh. The Nobel laureate meant to realize Indians' intellectual independence through learning, studying all of humanity, with a special attention to Japanese and Chinese civilization. The institution was determinedly unconventional. On arriving, Indira Nehru searched in vain for the classrooms and was startled to discover that her classes were held under the trees. "Everything is so artistic and beautiful and wild," she wrote to Nehru. In a respite from all too much politics, she was transfixed by art and poetry. She was awed by Tagore himself, a humane prophet complete with cascading white beard and hair. Following his universalist vision, she took courses in French and English, in Hindi and Bengali. Nehru wanted his daughter to learn to speak some Bengali and get to know the Bengalis a little better. Later, when Bengalis were slaughtered and West Bengal was overrun with desperate refugees, Bengalis would often say that she had a special feeling for them. She was hardly the most sentimental individual, but she was familiar with Bengal's heat and spring flowers, all the sounds and smells of the place. She had found Bengali a very sweet and nice language, and had soon gotten good enough that Tagore suggested she take literature classes in it. There was nothing abstract for her about the people who were suffering and dying. In a cruel twist, the site of this misery in 1971 was where she had tried to escape from politics long before. "I was away from politics, noise," she once said. It was a refuge and a new world. She grew up to plunge back into the politics and the noise. Her idyll in West Bengal gave way to more standard schools, in India and Britain. There are not a lot of government chiefs trained at both Santiniketan and Oxford. In 1942, she married a worldly, outgoing politician and journalist, Feroz Gandhi, taking his last name. She was no relation to Mahatma Gandhi. In the family tradition, she was arrested by the British after speaking to a rally in Allahabad. She languished in a dirty grey prison cell, sleeping on a concrete bed in the freezing cold. In the violence of partition, she on two separate occasions protected presumably Muslim men being chased by Hindu mobs. And she worked in filthy refugee camps for Muslims displaced by partition. After all that, it is hard to say what the humane lessons of Tagore might have meant to a steely, calculating politician. Her wariness of others was heightened by a miserable marriage, which ended when her husband died of a sudden heart attack at the age of 47. While Jawaharlal Nehru was Prime Minister, she was uneasy around the courtiers and hacks crowding his Grand Delhi residence, Teen Murti Bhavan. But in 1959, she threw herself into public life, becoming president of the dominant Indian National Congress, her father's political party. All grown up, Indira Gandhi was nobody's idea of a charmer. Jacqueline Kennedy, who scored rather higher in the social graces, found her a real prune, bitter, kind of pushy, horrible woman. Even those who liked her found her remote and withdrawn. Her closest friend wrote that she had a sharp temper and nursed grudges, and was secretive and private. She worked relentlessly, with the disconcerting habit of reading papers while someone was talking to her. One of her top advisors explained sympathetically that she was constantly tense from having to contend with the man's world of Indian government. Her aunt once famously called her the only man in her cabinet, which earned her a reputation as aloof, secretive and haughty. K.C. Pant, then a young Indian official from a prominent political family who went on to be defense minister, and says he was on friendly terms with her, recalls, "She could be very cold. Occasionally she had to freeze somebody. She could freeze them just by looking at them. She listened, she absorbed, she didn't speak much. India was born democratic. Nehru had a bedrock devotion to freedom of thought, the verdict of the ballot box, and the independence of the courts. But Gandhi had inherited somewhat less than a full portion of her iconic father's fundamental and sophisticated commitment to democracy. She was far more willing to manipulate people, and seemed quite aware that she lacked her father's saintliness. Jaswant Singh, who has served as India's foreign minister, defence minister, and finance minister in a rival party, remembers, "All along she felt, and she often said it, that my father was a saint in politics. I am not." She had not the same tolerance and acceptance of a differing viewpoint. Nehru died in 1964, leaving some people wondering if India could survive as a unified and democratic country. His daughter was given the modest job of running the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, but when the new Prime Minister, Lal Bahadur Shastri, dropped dead of a heart attack early in 1966, her name was suddenly floated for Prime Minister. Many of the ruling Congress Party's grandees imagined that she could be easily shoved around. They were wrong. In January 1966, Indira Gandhi was sworn in as Prime Minister in the magnificent Rashtrapati Bhavan. She was a novice, just 47 years old and untested, abruptly in charge of the world's largest democracy. It was and is an impossible job. She was confronted with all of India's problems: terrible poverty, widespread illiteracy, secessionist movements, bloody-minded revolutionaries, sclerotic government. But she quickly learned on the job. She reached out to the public, while presiding over a titanic patronage machine, doling out appointments and favors to every part of the country. She dedicated herself to fighting poverty. But it was rough going as she faced years of drought, a weak economy, and riots. Gandhi struggled to keep India united. She lived in dread of communal bloodshed between Hindus and Muslims in such vital states as Gujarat, Uttar Pradesh, and Bihar. To quell violence, she reminded the state governments that the central government's security forces, including the army, were available for use, and hoped that these would be called in time and not after the event. The new Prime Minister had to face secessionist revolts far from the country's center: Nagaland, Mizoram, and of course Kashmir. And while Indians preferred to point to the success stories, where democratic federalism managed to hold the country together, the Indian state sometimes harshly used force. When in March 1966 Mitso insurgents in the Hill country declared their independence from India, Gandhi's government sent in both the army and the air force, the first time that the Indian Air Force had been unleashed against Indian citizens. India marched troops against rebels in Nagaland too, where a peace effort fell apart, followed by brutal Naga terrorist attacks on civilians. Gandhi had been installed in office by the politicos, but in 1967 she won her first electoral mandate from the Indian public. In elections for the Lok Sabha, House of the People, the lower house of India's parliament, her Congress party managed to hold on to a majority, but was much weakened, which had the benefit of getting rid of some of her rivals inside the party. In 1969, the party split between the leftist Gandhi and her more conservative competitors, with intense sparring among them. By then, Gandhi was already chafing against the democratic restraints on her authority, eerily foreshadowing her notorious 1975 declaration of emergency rule, the terrible rupture in India's long history of democratic governance. When she first became Prime Minister, she was skeptical not just about the civil service and her own Congress party, but also about parliamentary democracy itself. She bridled at the incrementalism of the unwieldy Indian political system, with its thousands of daily compromises. "Sometimes I wish we had a real revolution, like France or Russia, at the time of independence." She had a penchant for crude censorship. In some of this, she had a little more in common with Richard Nixon than either of them would have liked to admit. The argumentative Indian. Indira Gandhi's most important advisor by far was P.N. Haxa, the principal secretary to the Prime Minister. Of all the self-important mandarins in South Block, arriving each morning to have their briefcases carried from the car up to the office by a servant striding ahead of them, he was the top. The job title is much too humble. He functioned essentially as her chief of staff and foremost foreign policy advisor. Henry Kissinger once called him, "My opposite number there, Haxa, who is probably a communist." In terms of the Nixon administration, P.N. Haxa was something like the Indian equivalent of H.R. Haldeman and Kissinger combined. He got vastly more face time with the new Prime Minister than any cabinet official, and exercised tremendous influence on her. Haxa was given to daydreaming and liked to dawdle in his bed, but, as he wrote late in his life, was driven to diligent toil out of moral obligation, or out of a sense of duty. Like Nehru, he hailed from an eminent family of Kashmiri Pandits, and strove to live up to the legacy. He inherited both a sense of perfectionism and a dread of dishonor, which was, he reflected, probably imbibed through constantly hearing since early childhood that our family could never be bribed, bought or made to bend. Such, at any rate, was the mythology of our family. And mythologies have a way of taking hold of one's mind, just as gravity holds one's body. He studied both mathematics and history, and became a conspicuously erudite lawyer, educated at Allahabad and the London School of Economics. His background was sufficiently posh that one of his uncles, who was Prime Minister of Jaipur under the British Empire, always served the tea-time cake iced with the colours of the Union Jack. But Haxa grew up amid political turmoil, surrounded by talk of Mahatma Gandhi and Jawaharlal Nehru's freedom struggle, with his mother telling him that the English were a nation of scoundrels. Gandhi had appeared on our horizon. He later said, and he grew larger every day, until he covered the entire sky. As a young man, dreaming of doing extraordinary deeds, Haxa gambled on an independent India. After partition, which he said made him spiritually sick, he hitched his fortunes to the Nehru family. This paid off handsomely. Haxa first met Indira Nehru Gandhi in his childhood. A tiny girl, perched on a servant's shoulder, was brought over to the Haxa's house in Nagpur, fondly announced as the only child of the great Nehru. Haxa later remembered only that, "Her eyes seemed to get bigger and brighter the more my mother fussed over her." Nehru himself encouraged the promising young man to join India's new foreign service, extolling his flair for political work. Haxa, with a beaky nose and bushy eyebrows, was more of a professional civil servant than a politico. His government service centered on the Ministry of External Affairs, with tours of duty in Nigeria, Austria, and Britain. His British posting particularly helped him clamber upward. Indira Gandhi was then studying at Oxford, and he got to know her. His loyalty to the family was smoothly extended to her. Where Gandhi lacked a well-considered political philosophy, Haxa was there to help provide it. He anchored her in democratic politics. His words could sometimes echo Nehru's. In the great fight against poverty, Haxa wanted to work within the existing secular democratic system. He struck liberal notes on minority rights, expansively declaring his commitment to freedom of speech, assembly, and worship for every single Indian citizen. Like Kissinger, Haxa was brainy, witty, verbose, arrogant, and abrasive. He took a long-range view, again like Kissinger, sometimes to the annoyance of those who wanted immediate policy and were less indulgent of intellectualism. He consolidated power over foreign policy in his office, pushing aside foreign ministers who came belatedly to realize who the real boss was. Haxa could be merciless to underlings, while always cultivating his relationship with the Prime Minister. Under Haxa, the Prime Minister's secretariat dominated the government. His senior colleagues found him warm and approachable, running the Prime Minister's team with a combination of energy and confidence, although, as one top aide noted, he tended to pontificate. Arundhati Gose, a diplomat who served under Haxa in Vienna and after, who would later read to an elderly Haxa as he slowly went blind, remembers him fondly. Haxa had a very wry sense of humor. He was extremely well-read, very affectionate, and very warm. She recalls his outsized influence, with all the powers of the Prime Minister's office, and his guiding role in India's foreign policy. According to Nehru's grand vision of non-alignment, India was to stand warily above the quarrelsome superpowers of the Cold War. But Haxa was in the thick of it, firmly committed to the Soviet side. He was staunchly leftist at home and abroad, leaning toward the Soviet Union so much that it alarmed other Indian officials. He was joined in this by some of the other leading pro-Soviet Indians who were Gandhi's closest advisors, all of them Kashmiri Brahmins like her, thus quickly dubbed the Kashmiri Mafia. Gose remembers that her mentor never hid his left-wing views. Although he did not impose his leftism on his subordinates, she says, it came out in everything that he said or did. Indira Gandhi was not as pro-Soviet as Haxa, but she was already leery of the United States. On her first visit to Washington as Prime Minister in 1966, she got along well with Lyndon Johnson, and tried to get him to restart U.S. economic aid to India, which had been suspended during the India-Pakistan War of 1965. But they sparred over the devaluation of the rupee and, later, over the Middle East and the Vietnam War. She was stung by Johnson's attempts to use food aid for leverage and by lectures from other U.S. officials. Facing famine in 1966, she resented the slowness of U.S. food shipments. Meanwhile, Haxa pushed her further toward the Soviet Union. She sought more Soviet arms sales, helping India to build up a formidable military machine. When the Soviet Union invaded Czechoslovakia in 1968, India refused to vote for a United Nations resolution condemning the brutal crackdown on Czech liberals. Gandhi's government was grateful to the Soviet Union for help with industrialization and nurturing India's defense industry. Gosei says that largely, as a result of Haksa Sahib's influence, the government had a distrust of the Americans. They didn't trust us, we didn't trust them. For that, the Nixon administration loathed him. Samuel Hoskinson, Kissinger's staffer for South Asia at the White House, shudders operatically at the mention of his name. It brings back nothing but bad memories. He says, he was an arrogant Brahmin, pretty far left, difficult to discuss anything with. He always wants the upper hand. You don't have a discussion. He fires verbal volleys. Hoskinson hated his pro-Soviet politics too. He was quite far left. He may have been a communist. He wasn't, although Hoskinson doubted it. Some US officials felt that he might be controlled by the Russians, that he was actually an asset of the KGB. Indira Gandhi's power was limited by her party's standing in parliament. Frustratingly dependent on socialist and leftist parties, she was in a weak position, while her more conservative foes were maneuvering against her. She had no patience for the opposition. In December 1970, taking advantage of her popularity, she boldly chose a democratic way out, calling new general elections. The Lok Sabha was dissolved, and Indian politicians hit the hustings, from Uttar Pradesh to Gujarat to Kerala. It was the biggest election in the world. In the end, more than 151 million voters cast their ballots. She gambled her entire political future on the outcome. Gandhi campaigned hard on a populist platform, dedicated to ending India's grinding poverty. When her rivals put up the Hindi slogan of Indira Hatao, remove Indira, she parried with what became her famous catchphrase, Garibi Hatao, remove poverty. She spoke to some 375 meetings, barely sleeping or eating as she campaigned all across the vast country. Astonishingly, in 43 days of electioneering, she claimed to have given speeches in front of as many as 13 million people. She later liked to boast that she never spoke at a rally with fewer than 100,000 people. She hammered home her core themes, getting rid of unemployment, helping peasants and shopkeepers, whipping the much-despised civil service into line. It worked. Gandhi and her team won a massive landslide. Her party, known since the split in the Congress Party as Congress Republican, seized a two-thirds majority in the Lok Sabha. Her own campaigning was crucial to this terrific sweep, and she was now in an extraordinarily strong position. Her foreign minister, Sardar Swaran Singh, would later brag about the Indira typhoon. Sidney Schanberg, the New York Times correspondent in Delhi, was impressed. Settling into the newspaper's bureau on Janpath, in the heart of Delhi, he had grown fond of India. It has terrible problems, but it is a democracy. He says, the people do like to throw the bums out when they vote. Having won the election on her anti-poverty campaign, Gandhi faced high expectations at home. But the crisis in Pakistan quickly overwhelmed her government's focus on relieving India's poor. As Gandhi said, our country was poised for rapid economic advance and a more determined attack on the age-old poverty of our people. Even as we were settling down to these new tasks, we have been engulfed by a new and gigantic problem, not of our making. While Gandhi's government might have been tempted to gloat at Pakistan's troubles in governing East Bengal, the Indian government was painfully aware of its own difficulties in keeping a grip on its own state of West Bengal. The Indian state was a hotbed of Marxist and Maoist agitation, notorious as the home of the fiery Maoist revolutionaries known as the Naxalites, named after the West Bengali village of Naxalbari, where the movement originated. Haksa despised the cult of violence of the Naxalites and radicals in West Bengal. Gandhi's government, horrified by the violent and pro-Chinese Naxalites, feared an armed communist takeover of parts of the country. Gandhi and her allies struggled to get the better of both the Naxalites and the powerhouse Communist Party Marxist. Calcutta was flooded with Maoist literature. Remembered one journalist. Mao Tse-tung, Liu Shaoqi, Marx, Lenin. The city was red. From October 1969 to the middle of 1971, we broke the back of the Naxalite revolt in West Bengal. Remembers Lieutenant General Jacob Faj Raphael Jacob, then a Major General and the Chief of Staff of the Army's Eastern Command. Mrs. Gandhi told me to do it. People were thrown in jail on specific charges or under a notorious Preventive Detention Act. Haxa knew that there were some 10,000 young people in jail in West Bengal, and that more than 100,000 political workers were facing criminal charges. The West Bengal state government requested the deployment of Indian Army troops to maintain order. Gandhi's central government offered large coercive forces to the West Bengal local government, including battalions of police, the Border Security Force, and almost 2 divisions of the Indian Army. Moderate politicians feared what the communists, who had done well in the elections, might do if they were allowed to run the state, and violent mass unrest if they were not. The governor of West Bengal bleakly told Gandhi that, "Restoring law and order may be an unpleasant duty." The Indian ambassador in Washington admitted, "Considering that we ourselves have plenty of problems in East India, we would not wish for East Bengal to be in a disturbed state." Pakistan votes. India was thrilled by Pakistan's novel experiment in democracy. The Pakistani elections in December 1970 touched a chord in India, where democratic precepts ran deep, and where Gandhi had just had her big electoral win. Indians savoured the drubbing the Pakistani military received at the hands of their electorate, and many educated Indians relished the voting as a repudiation of the founding ideal of Pakistan as a Muslim state, which was not enough to keep the two halves of the country from coming unglued. Mujib's thumping victory in East Bengal was a foregone conclusion. Wrote a senior Indian diplomat. Culturally they're quite different. Recalls Jagat Mehta, a former Indian foreign secretary. It was in the seeds of time. The Indian government was heartened to hear Mujib call for friendship with India and for a peaceful resolution in Kashmir. Indians hoped that a democracy in Pakistan would prove peaceful toward them, particularly if the Awami League, warm to India, managed to form a government in Islamabad. India's foreign intelligence agency, the Research and Analysis Wing, the RAW, created as a kind of Indian answer to the CIA, concluded that a genuinely democratic Pakistan would increasingly desist from military confrontations against India. Not everyone swooned. Haxa worried that the humiliated Pakistani military would lash out against India. "I have long been feeling a sense of uneasiness about the intentions of Pakistan," he wrote to Gandhi. The Awami League's resounding victory made Pakistan's internal problems infinitely more difficult. Consequently, the temptation to seek solution of these problems by external adventures has become very great. He implored Gandhi to quietly convene her service chiefs of staff and defense minister to share with them her anxieties and have the military make a very realistic assessment both of Pakistan's capability and our response. "I have a feeling that there are many weak spots in our defense capabilities." India's spies were similarly uneasy. The RAW answered directly to Gandhi's office, and was run by yet another Kashmiri Brahmin, R.N. Kao, who was eager to burnish his agency's reputation. It delivered a top-secret alert to Gandhi's government on the impressive increase of Pakistan's military power in recent years, and warned that Pakistan might foment violent agitation and sabotage in Kashmir. The RAW warned that there was a quite real risk that Pakistan, bolstered by Chinese support, would attack India. Like Haxa, the RAW worried that Yahya would be tempted into a military venture against India. With a view to diverting the attention of the people from the internal political problems and justifying the continuance of martial law. But despite this, the RAW was confident that Mujib and Bhutto, the dominant popular forces in their respective wings, would probably cut a deal, avoiding a crisis or military crackdown. Similarly, one of Gandhi's inner circle remembered that the Prime Minister's Secretariat, reading its reports from Dhaka, thought that sort of settlement between Yahya and Mujib was in the works. He recalled that even the appointment of the brutal Lieutenant General Tika Khan as governor of East Pakistan was seen as just for show. Haxa, however, quietly prepared for the worst. "Our requirements are extremely urgent," he wrote, alarmed at Pakistan's new offensive capabilities. With Nixon starting to sell weapons to Pakistan again, India made a huge request to the Soviet Union for bomber aircraft, tanks, armored personnel carriers, ammunition, surface-to-air missiles, and radar. Haxa nervously instructed the Indian ambassador in Moscow, "We have no other source of supply." India's diplomats in Dhaka made no attempt to disguise their sympathies. They eagerly reported the mass mobilization of the Bengalis. When Mujib spoke to a colossal rally of over 1 million people at the racecourse in Dhaka, with the crowd singing Rabindranath Tagore's nationalist song, "My Golden Bengal," the top Indian official in Dhaka refused that. Bengali nationalism has gone deep into the minds of the people. As Yahya flew to Dhaka for constitutional negotiations with Mujib, the Indian government watched hopefully. India's chief diplomat in Dhaka worried that Mujib's call for an autonomous East Pakistan seemed to undercut Pakistan's unity. Mujib ominously warned that conspiracies in Pakistan's ruling classes were trying to thwart the democratic will of the people. But they are playing with fire. Our people are conscious and they would resist any conspiratorial move. In private, India's diplomats heaped spiteful abuse on Bhutto, who was notoriously hostile to their country. India's enthusiasm for democracy in Pakistan did not include Bhutto's own electoral triumph. The Indian mission in Karachi sneered, "Mr. Bhutto has really secured power through slogan-mongering and his not inconsiderable histrionic talents." Indian officials blamed him for stonewalling the constitutional talks. A senior Indian diplomat posted in Islamabad would later accuse Bhutto of being directly responsible for encouraging military action against Awami League. Bhutto, one of Gandhi's senior aides, later wrote, "Approved of the merciless military offensive." In the middle of these tense negotiations, India faced a spectacular act of terrorism. On January 30, in Srinagar, two young separatist Kashmiri Indians hijacked an Indian Airlines airplane to Lahore, in West Pakistan, and then blew it up in a fiery blaze. Although nobody was hurt, the furious Indian government immediately assumed the hijackers were Pakistani agents. As a tough reprisal, Gandhi's government suspended flights of Pakistani military and civilian aircraft over Indian territory, making it hard for Pakistan to keep up links between its two far-flung wings. Yahya would accuse India of arranging the hijacking to justify this decision to ban overflights. In West Pakistan, politicians fired off denunciations of India, and Bhutto had a friendly meeting with the hijackers, but in East Pakistan, Mujib swiftly denounced the destruction of the airplane, while Bengalis, unconcerned with competing claims in Kashmir, condemned the terrorists. This episode afforded India a tantalizing glimpse of the transformed relationship that it might have enjoyed with Pakistan under a Bengali-led government. The Raw's prediction of a deal among Pakistan's leading politicians proved far too optimistic. Mujib insisted that his majority in the National Assembly entitled him to frame a new Pakistani constitution, ushering in autonomy for East Pakistan. But when Bhutto dug in his heels in early March, Indian officials noted sourly that Mr. Bhutto took recourse to his familiar anti-Indian bogey. From Islamabad, Indian diplomats warned that hardliners were putting increasing pressure on Yahya. An Indian official wrote that the armed forces and the predominantly Punjabi establishment in West Pakistan is back at its 23-year-old game of not allowing East Pakistan to exercise its majority share in the country's affairs. As Bengalis protested, Indian diplomats in Dhaka reported with alarm that hundreds of civilians were killed or injured, and scorned Yahya's suggestion that the army is above democratically elected representatives playing at constitution making. This, Indian officials wrote, smacked of Latin American-style despotism. India's government remained wholeheartedly for Mujib. The top Indian diplomat in Dhaka admiringly reported, his constitutional method, solicitude for democratic process, discussion with West Pakistan leaders and the spirit of accommodation within the framework of his commitment are likely to create a favorable impression on President Yahya Khan and the people of West Pakistan. One of Gandhi's top advisers remembers that the Prime Minister's staff thought that some kind of deal had been struck. Other senior Indian officials in Delhi, however, were bracing for disaster. On March 2, over 3 weeks before Yahya launched his slaughter, Gandhi ordered her best and brightest, including Haxa and the raw spymaster Kao, to evaluate giving help to Bangladesh and the possibility of recognizing an independent Bangladesh. That, Gandhi feared, could easily prompt Pakistani retaliation in Kashmir, or a Chinese military response. The Prime Minister was already considering military aid to the Bengalis, who would need not just medicine and food, but a helicopter and a small airplane for quick movement inside India around the borders of Bangladesh. As well as arms and ammunition, including light machine guns, medium machine guns and mortars. India urged the United States to hold Yahya back from a crackdown. In Washington, the Indian ambassador pleaded that nothing would be more tragic than President Yahya Khan trying to suppress East Bengali aspirations for autonomy by force. By March 15, the Pakistani Foreign Office complained that India had built up its military forces in West Bengal. But Yahya showed no signs of taking on India now. In the days after the hijacking, Pakistan had massed its troops on West Pakistan's border with India, but now the RAW and the Chief of the Army Staff, General Sam Manekshaw, found that most of those troops had been withdrawn. Yahya had more than doubled his army strength in East Pakistan. Pakistan's military rulers seemed to be marshalling their fire for their own populace. Haksar urged Gandhi to stand firm. "We should not at this stage of developments in Pakistan say anything at all placatory, but be tough within reason. This is not the time to make gestures for friendship for Pakistan. Every such gesture will bring comfort to Yahya Khan and make the position of Mujib correspondingly more difficult." Haksar ominously warned the Prime Minister. 2.5 divisions of Pak Army is poised to decimate East Bengal.